Yeah, no, I think that's Thank you. Yeah, we're ready.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you.
Policies Forum, co-organized with the Institute for Economics and Peace, looking at operationalizing sustaining peace and the 2018 Global Peace Index. My name is Daisy Connolly and I lead the work here at IPI on peace building and sustaining peace. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this very hot summer day. This is the 6th event this year in our series on unpacking sustaining peace. As many of you will know, in January of this year, the Secretary General released a report on peace building and sustaining peace, outlining ways in which the UN is implementing sustaining peace and proposing ways to strengthen its operationalization. In support of this report, the General Assembly and Security Council passed another set of dual resolutions in April of this year, giving this sort of endorsement for continued implementation of these recommendations. Connected to this, we've seen in 2017 the UN World Bank study on pathways for peace, which really complements the sustaining peace agenda by looking at how to improve domestic development processes to prevent conflict from becoming violent. This study sets out a framework to advance more preventative approaches to development work as a means of preventing violence and sustaining peace. As we move forward in the implementation of sustaining peace, there's a real need to understand what this means in practice and move beyond the New York discourse around these resolutions. Over the past 2 years, IPI has been working on the topic of sustaining peace, and this year we're really trying to look at what shape this agenda takes in the field. And the Global Peace Index is an excellent tool to assist us in understanding what builds and sustains peace in different country contexts. The Global Peace Index is the most comprehensive data-driven analysis to date on trends in peace, methodologically ranking countries according to their levels of peacefulness and identifying potential determinants of peace. It's comprised of 23 indicators measuring the absence of violence across 3 domains: militarization, ongoing conflict, and societal safety and security. It includes a statistical analysis of positive peace as well, so the attitudes, institutions, and structures that correlate to peace. Now, not to steal any of Michelle's thunder, but when reading the Global Peace Index, there are just 4 main takeaways that I thought were really interesting. In general, in 2018, the global level of peace, or in the 2018 index, the global level of peace has deteriorated by 0.27%, making it the 4th successive year of deterioration. However, 71 countries actually improved in peacefulness. And one of these countries is the Gambia, which is a country that IPI has been working on quite extensively. The improvements seen in political instability, perceptions of criminality, and relations with neighboring countries sort of improved 35 places, moving up to 76. As IPI, we've been advocating that there's a huge amount that we can learn from the Gambia, and I think that this data really reinforces that point. Lastly, this year finds that peacefulness has had a considerable impact on macroeconomic performance. So in the last 70 years, per capita growth has been 3 times higher in peaceful countries when compared to countries of low levels of peace. This really highlights the same arguments that the UN World Bank Pathways for Peace brings up, that the cost of violence is becoming unsustainable and we need to shift towards more upstream prevention financing. So with me today, I have an excellent panel that will unpack some of the key findings from this report and then the potential implications of these findings for sustaining peace, trying to provide this bridge between policy and data trends. With me on my left, I have Michelle Bresnauer, who is the Program Director of the Institute for Economics and Peace, who will outline the Global Peace Index. Followed from that, we have 3 respondents. To my right, Robert Piper, UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of External Relations at UNDP. On my furthest left, Vanessa White, Senior Political Advisor at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the UN. And to my furthest right, we have Susanna Campbell, Assistant Professor at the School of International Service at American University. After concluding the panel, we hope to have about 30 minutes for question and answers and discussion with the audience. So we really hope that we do have a rich discussion here today. So without further ado, I will pass over to Michelle to give us some outlines of this report.
Thank you, Leslie, and thanks to everybody who showed up today. I think I see one extra seat right there. Somebody wants to come and grab it. As Leslie mentioned, my name is Michelle Breslauer. I'm with the Institute for Economics and Peace, and I'd like to thank the International Peace Institute for co-hosting this discussion with us. So I'm going to be referring to a number of slides. I hope that you can see them. And I'll go through them fairly quickly as well. There are screens up there and over here. All of the data, trends, and analysis that I'll be speaking to is available online on our website. So I'll be highlighting some key trends. You can always go onto the website, download the report, or look more closely at what's happening in specific countries. The Institute for Economics and Peace is a not-for-profit think tank. We are based in Sydney, Australia, and we have offices here in New York, in Brussels, The Hague, and Mexico City. So I'll start with something that Leslie referred to, which is that the cost of violence to the global economy is high. So each year, IEP calculates a number of different dimensions to understand what the economic impact of violence is. And we find that for 2017, it was $14.76 trillion. That's equivalent to 12.4% of global GDP, or almost $2,000 per person. And just to put those numbers into perspective, a 1% reduction in the cost of violence is equivalent to all total ODA, or foreign aid, for 2017, while a 10% reduction is equivalent to all total foreign direct investment for 2017, or the total economies of Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium. Today, I'm going to speak about the results of the 2018 Global Peace Index. Some of the key findings Leslie has highlighted, but this is the 12th year of the index. It is a ranking of 163 countries and territories, and it looks at relative states of peace. So countries compared to each other or compared to themselves year on year. We use 23 indicators, and they're weighted on a scale of 1 to 5. And we have a 3-part system for the development of the research data sets and analysis, working with the Economist Intelligence Unit, a panel of international statisticians and peace and conflict experts, and of course our research team at IEP. The measures broadly fall into 3 categories. So we have ongoing domestic and international conflict, militarization, and societal safety and security. And what's important to highlight here is the fact that we're looking not only at peacefulness within countries, we're also looking at how countries respond to each other and external indicators of peacefulness. So for the 2018 Global Peace Index, which is a measure of March 2017 to March 2018, the headline finding is that peace has gone down and that the world is less peaceful today than at any time in the last decade. And I use the last decade as a measurement period because we're referring to the length of time of the index and how long we've been measuring. So what do we see driving these trends? Over the past year, there have been deteriorations in all 3 domains of the index. So we see militarization increase, safety and security deteriorate, and ongoing conflict increase as well. And this is driven by the fact that 92 countries became less peaceful versus 71 that became more peaceful. When we look at some of the specific indicators driving this trend, political terror, which broadly refers to state-sponsored terror, detentions without a sentence, extrajudicial killings, that has gotten worse. 42 countries deteriorated on the political terror scale versus 29 that improved. We also see the intensity of internal conflict going up, with 6 countries that deteriorated versus 2 countries that improved. Now, the indicator with the largest improvement was military expenditure, which is calculated as a percentage of GDP, with 88 countries spending less on their military and 44 countries spending more. When we look at some of the country-level highlights, we see that Syria remains the world's least peaceful nation. Syria is followed on that table by Afghanistan, South Sudan, Iraq, and Somalia. Qatar and the Democratic Republic of Congo have the largest deteriorations in their score. South America as a region had the largest deterioration. Looking at the most peaceful countries, Iceland is again the most peaceful country, followed by New Zealand, Austria, Portugal, and Denmark. And as Leslie mentioned, the Gambia and Liberia had the largest improvements. In terms of regions, South Asia had the largest regional improvement, although it was a very small one. And Europe remains the most peaceful region, but it did deteriorate on all 3 domains of the Global Peace Index. So I just wanted to highlight the countries that improved the most and those that deteriorated the most. So it's probably hard to read here, but the countries that had the largest improvements were the Gambia, Liberia, Iraq, Burundi, and Senegal. So 4 of the 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Generally, the countries that improved the most year on year in the index are coming from situations of greater instability. Oftentimes there were elections that caused violence and instability, and a country is moving out of that year on year. And when we look at the countries that had the greatest deteriorations, we see Qatar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Togo, Spain, and Myanmar. And I'm not going to get into too much details about each one of those to move on to some other information, but I can answer questions or refer you to the report. So importantly, we also look at the trends. So we're looking here over a decade-long period, and we see that the average level of global peacefulness declined 2.38% since 2008, and we saw declines in 8 of the last 10 years. Over half the countries in Europe, which is the world's most peaceful region in the index, have deteriorated in peacefulness. So the most peaceful countries are getting less peaceful. And no Nordic country is more peaceful now than it was in 2008. One of the driving trends for this is that 62% of countries have experienced an increase in the impact of terrorism over the last decade. And for the first time, nearly 1% of the global population is now displaced. Looking on the positive end, militarization has improved in the majority of countries with an average improvement of 3.2%. And the biggest improvements in that area were armed forces rates and military expenditures. Now, in general, the more peaceful a country was in 2008, the less likely it was to have deteriorated in peacefulness over the last decade. So we're seeing a greater inequality in peacefulness between the most peaceful and least peaceful countries. So you'll see the lines in this chart growing away from each other. And while there's been some fluctuation in the level of peacefulness of the world's most peaceful countries, the change has been minimal, with a very slight 0.9% improvement in peacefulness. So there is a resilience there. And by contrast, the world's least peaceful countries have experienced a clear and sustained deterioration in peacefulness by an average 12.7%. So cycles of conflict and instability can trap countries at the bottom of the index as well. And as Leslie mentioned, there are macroeconomic indicators that we see associated with peacefulness. In the last 70 years, per capita GDP growth has been nearly 3 times higher in highly peaceful countries compared to those with low levels of peace. And if we review the economic benefits of peace over the past decade, countries that improved in peace had GDP growth rates almost 7 times higher than those that decreased in peace. Now, I've just outlined all the things we generally do not want in the world, but the Institute also tries to understand from a quantitative perspective what drives peaceful societies. So we use two definitions of peace. So the Global Peace Index is a measure of negative peace. It's the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence. But we want to understand what drives peace, so we look at positive peace, the attitudes, institutions, and structures that sustain peaceful societies. And to that end, we've compared over 9,000 broad cross-country data sets to multiple years of the Global Peace Index to try to understand what correlates most strongly with the most peaceful societies. And so we have this 8-part framework that was statistically derived, and it includes a well-functioning government, which broadly encompasses rule of law, access to justice, taxation, the equitable distribution of resources, income, health, education, the free flow of information, which includes freedom for journalists, media safety, access to internet, good relations with neighbors, which at the national level encompasses diplomatic relations between countries, high levels of human capital, a measure of youth development, of education rates, of scientific publications, the acceptance of the rights of others, which broadly includes many human rights issues of gender equality, workers' rights, formal human rights laws, tolerance towards different ethnic groups, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. And the most important thing to think about these pillars is that they're multidimensional, that they're interrelated, so they all connect to each other, and they represent a peace system. And the peace system that we see when we do additional analysis is one that also tends to include countries that have higher per capita income, greater levels of resilience, better environmental outcomes, higher GDP growth per annum, and better performance on the Millennium Development Goals. Many of the indicators of the positive peace framework within these pillars here broadly reflect the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets there. And when we do a little bit more analysis on the positive peace framework, we took a closer look at the relationship between positive peace and economic outcomes. And we analyzed a group of countries that improved the most in positive peace since 1996. So that's the time frame that we were looking at. And the improved countries had on average 2% higher GDP growth than countries that deteriorated in positive peace. And every 1% improvement in positive peace was associated with almost 3% growth in real GDP per capita. Similarly, countries that improve in positive peace also experience higher rates of appreciation in the real value of their currency, while countries that deteriorated in positive peace experienced a fall in their credit ratings. And when we try to look at the trends in positive peace globally, we saw that overall positive peace around the world has been improving since 2005. But this improvement has stagnated. So you'll see here that since 2013, positive peace has been leveling off and plateauing. And the region that experienced the largest deteriorations across the highest number of those 8 pillars that I outlined was the Middle East and North Africa region, unsurprisingly. And when we look at some of the positive peace pillars, so those bubbles, and their changes, we've seen that since 2013, which is the period in which positive peace is falling and plateauing in the world, the pillar of acceptance of the rights of others has deteriorated across every region. And in particular, we've seen that deterioration begin in Europe and North America since 2005, so a longer time frame. Now, while the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index do stand alone for measurement and empirical reasons, they have to be understood alongside each other. So we need the Positive Peace Index to look for insights on how to improve in the Global Peace Index. And the report finds that 70% of countries that recorded large improvements in the reduction of conflict and violence had sustained improvements in positive peace beforehand. But a key message from this year's report is that it's much harder to build peace than it is to destroy it. So we found that in order to improve in negative peace, so to advance in the Global Peace Index, there must be improvements across a broad range of the pillars of positive peace. Effective institutions, fair structures, and material well-being provide the resilience to resolve any arising group grievances or political conflicts non-violently. However, a deterioration in peacefulness can be triggered by just a handful of indicators. So more specifically, we've seen that deteriorations in group grievances, the control of corruption, and the freedom of the press are common leading indicators of conflict onset in these indices. So as we continue to develop the evidence base for an empirical understanding of peace, we hope to bring more and more nuance to the peace building practice and to the prevention world as well. We've long known that while breakdowns in peace are quick and severe, peace building is slow and incremental. And that social factors that cause violence are not the same factors that need to change in order to reduce and recover from violence. And this year's report supports that hypothesis, showing that the leading indicators of breakdowns in peace tend to be political in nature, while leading indicators of improvements in peacefulness tend to be structural, institutional, or material and economic. These findings are making a strong case for prevention, and the 2018 Global Peace Index implies that prevention requires fewer investments than does recovery, meaning that will also be more cost-effective than post-conflict or post-violence peace building. And I hope that these findings can help inform our panel today, and I want to thank our panelists as well for joining me to reflect on the Global Peace Index. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. As you highlighted, there's a huge amount that we can take away from the Global Peace Index in terms of rich data trends on the trends of peacefulness as well as determinants of peace. So now to try and bring some context to this data and really connect it to the policy discussions that are taking place within the New York context, we have three panelists here to respond. I'll first turn to you, Robert, to really look at from the UN perspective and given your experience in the field, what does prevention look like on the ground? How can development, planning, and programs support the sustaining peace agenda, and how do we measure the success around it?
Thank you, Leslie and Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. It's just a pleasure, a real pleasure to join you for this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Incredibly valuable analysis. I think it's absolutely gripping. And it's very striking to start with immediately that the fact that it is a universal analysis, that we're not looking south, we're looking at Europe as well, and we can celebrate Iceland, but we also know that Europe's trends have also are less rosy than they were once upon a time. And I think that universality has got to be really one of the organising ideas for all of us in this SDG era. It's a very powerful index, I think, in terms of trying to push member states to move from early warning to early action, the old problem, and by documenting, I think, so effectively the costs of inaction. And when I look at that index and the curve from the last, say, 10 years, it's a report card in a way on the Security Council and the ability or not of the world to act and do the right thing when they see the signals. For me, I also feel very strongly that this is a building block, another very powerful building block in building a kind of the evidence base for what works and what doesn't work in terms of prevention. And this is something I'm 29 years in the UN almost, that this has been, I think, the big organising, certainly for me, the motivation for joining the UN in the first place. And over these almost 3 decades, I've watched these blocks being built towards prevention. It's been talked about so much, and I think this really does fill in another piece of it. Of course, it's not new, this index, but it's come at a very good time. It complements other analyses like the Pathways for Peace report, which I thought was pretty groundbreaking, with the World Bank and the UN coming together to really identify very sensitive issues that were clear drivers of conflict, things that we intuitively know, I think, in this room: inequality, exclusion, injustice, the sense of grievance, those areas of contention around land and power and so forth. To have that put out there by the UN and the World Bank, particularly the World Bank, I think, an institution that is usually pretty skittish about talking about grievances and so forth, really does try and move this conflict prevention debate away from the political into the technocratic, if you will. We've got to get this thing as dry and scientific as possible if we're going to make progress. And so I felt that Pathways for Peace was a crucial element in creating this, if you will, doctrine. And this index, and particularly I would say for me, this positive peace dimensions, and there's overlap with the Pathways for Peace report in looking at functioning government and looking at the distribution of resources, in looking at relations with the neighborhood and so forth. It's also building this doctrine for what appears to work well if you're going to be prevention savvy, if you will. They come also in partnership with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think that is something we're obviously very excited about. It's a huge organising idea for the world. The SDGs have a preventative lens, I feel, very much embedded throughout, with its emphasis on inequality, with its emphasis on justice and institutions, with its emphasis on poverty. The SDGs kind of provide, again, through a development lens, apparently quite non-political, an incredibly powerful platform on which to do prevention and stop talking about it. The whole notion for me of leaving no one behind is an incredibly powerful organising idea. It captures a lot of the analysis that comes behind your Positive Peace Index. It captures a lot of the analysis behind the Pathways for Peace analysis. If you can get that right, leaving no one behind, it may not, and it certainly won't prevent and anticipate any possible conflict. We know that, but it's going to get you a long way forward if we can achieve that. We've made a lot of progress, I think, in the field over the last few decades. But we've made it, I think, really so far in post-conflict environments, and that's where I've worked mostly: Nepal, Cambodia, the Sahel, Kosovo. I can point. I think we've made a tremendous amount of progress in building a much more sophisticated understanding of really what makes peace stick, and so learning from analyses like this about work with institutions. Working on governance and the neglected kind of peripheries of countries, looking at regional sort of systems failure, looking at very sensitive issues around opinions, of perceptions of inequality, injustice, satisfaction and otherwise. With even in Kosovo, we did opinion polls on what people felt about the UN peacekeeping mission, which was made for pretty ugly reading some of the times, but we needed to understand that pulse. It's not only about states when we find ourselves in these multidisciplinary peacekeeping operations. I spent 5 years in Nepal, where we really worked from a very ambitious peace process to look at the structural drivers of what had brought Nepal into the crisis that it did. And we worked on constitutions, on transitional justice, on human rights institutions, on discrimination, exclusion, on land, and so forth. And it echoes, I think, again, unsurprisingly, this idea of a positive peace. These indicators are familiar ones. And it's lovely to see Liberia, for example, one of the big success stories, relatively speaking, from this analysis, because, of course, the UN and the member states of the UN have invested massively in trying to bring Liberia to a new chapter. So I think we have a great story to tell well, a much better story to tell, I don't want to exaggerate, in those post-conflict environments, those 20, 30 countries. But we've really still remained confined largely to that list of 30 countries or so where early action has failed, where we have had a conflict, and we're trying to make peace stick. But the big idea behind sustaining peace is this very powerful idea that peace isn't a given, that you actually have to maintain it. If you're not deliberate about it, then you should not be surprised one day to find yourself in a very, in a very difficult position with the types of the indicators that Michelle mentioned, where it's, as she said, it's much easier to unravel than it is to rebuild. And so there, I think the big breakthrough we're looking for is when we bring this agenda to the 70, 80 countries that we don't talk about at the IPI, that don't make it into the Security Council or the ICG analysis, the extent to which this doctrine really does become kind of mainstreamed into a development agenda, into the kind of daily hum, as someone wrote, of governance around the world. I see some progress here as a development person. We work more on inclusive parliaments. We work more, of course, on human rights institutions than ever before, on media, on neglected areas and so forth. And we have this incredible SDG framework in which to tackle inequality. The UPR, the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council, is, I think, one of the most powerful new instruments of the last decade that we have to act preventatively in those non-usual suspect countries where we really do need to get this doctrine embedded. But it still hasn't, I don't think, penetrated our operating system yet. The topics remain extremely sensitive. Our country analyses for the UN are good now on identifying structural disadvantages today, but still very weak at anticipating the vulnerabilities of tomorrow. What are the risks out there that will potentially change this trajectory? We're better on natural disasters and earthquakes, of course, but still on the political and sort of conflict side, very, very tentative. I see in 3 decades, and I'll finish on this, I see this amazing progress on environment where I think it's become really embedded in our operating system, certain assumptions about sustainability and the decisions you make in development that now have to factor in what you're handing to the next generation. I see us making substantial progress, but still with a way to go on gender issues. I feel we're not near, we have come quite far in 3 decades. But for me, this is the big frontier, the next one, on conflict prevention, and that becoming not a political issue, but a very technocratic, basic bread and butter issue of doing good development with the sophistication of understanding how you need to actively sustain peace, that it's not a given. And in that respect, I think this index provides us with a lot of fantastic material to work with at the country level, above all, where of course it matters. I'll stop there, Leslie. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Robert. I think you raised some valid points about the need to socialize these discussions and broaden the countries that we focus on, as well as the actors that we're speaking to try and gain traction around conflict prevention and sustaining peace. And now to turn to Vanessa for more of a member state perspective. And given the active role that Canada has been playing in terms of peace building and sustaining peace, how can the political will be mobilized in support of the sustaining peace agenda? What are the opportunities and what are the challenges that face us?
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you to IPI and the Institute for Economics and Peace for inviting me to be part of such a distinguished panel. And thanks to all of you for being here today. I was asked to speak a little bit more on the member state side and how do we generate political will, but I think Michelle and Robert have done a very good job of kind of laying out the arguments for this. What we've seen on the member state side, I spend my days in meeting rooms with other member states talking about these issues. And what we've seen since the days when we were first negotiating the Sustaining Peace Resolution is we saw a conversation that was very much about the what. What does sustaining peace mean? What's included in it? What's not included in it? How do we maintain an integrity of mandates while also breaking down silos? A lot of conceptual debates and a lot of debates about ideas that made some member states uncomfortable, and a lot of people using language to mean different things. I think we've actually come a very long way in the way we talk about it. I think we've finally kind of settled some of these conceptual debates. I think there is a pretty broad recognition and acceptance that when we talk about sustaining peace, we're not necessarily talking about something really new. We're talking about doing a better job as the UN system as a whole in addressing some of these dynamics that we've just been talking about, in addressing risks of conflict through the conflict cycle, and in pulling together all the tools that we have through the three pillars of the UN system. And so in April we had a high-level meeting where we saw just incredible endorsement at a political level among member states for this concept. And I think that's our first real opportunity, that we have consensus now on what it is we're talking about. I mean, with some outliers, but for the most part. And that we're able to really shift this conversation to the how. And I think once we start talking about what this looks like in practice, what it is that we mean when we talk about sustaining peace, what are the practical tools we have, you provide a platform for countries to start to share their experiences. And by doing so, I think helps socialize all of us to the fact that we are talking about a lot of the same issues across a range of countries, whether they're countries in conflict, countries who have come out of conflict, countries that have never experienced conflict. That we're able to talk specifically about the way the UN operates in practice, and really recognize that in a lot of ways we do a very good job in the field at addressing some of these things. So I think the first real opportunity we have is when we really get specific about what we mean and we stop talking about these very broad concepts. And it's been quite refreshing, I think I speak for many member states in the room, to be able to actually start having that conversation. But I think, there's a lot of questions, and the problem is, as member states, we're not the ones implementing programs in the field. We're the diplomats sitting in rooms and getting a better understanding of what it looks like to implement this agenda, what does it look like in practice, what does integrated analysis mean, what are some of the things we say, what does it look like in practice. And this is where I think the work that the Global Peace Index has done gives us such a valuable roadmap to start having this conversation in a more holistic way. And as Robert said, other studies that we've seen, particularly the UN World Bank study on prevention, has been so helpful. I think we've had, a field that has very much been dominated by conflict as our unit of analysis, by understanding what causes conflict, as we said. And as you said so well, Michelle, the things that cause conflict aren't necessarily, you can't just reverse engineer the drivers of peace from what you understand to be the drivers of conflict. When you take peace as the unit of analysis, you start actually arriving at different answers. And so having the Global Peace Index as one of the first real effort to kind of take an evidence-based look at what those drivers of peace are and present it in an annual way, I think has really helped advance this debate. I think the problem that we're stuck in a little bit right now is there is a conversation around, in particular, the links between conflict and development or peace and development that's very much a zero-sum thinking, this sense that peace is here, investments in peace are here, and that's a peace and security thing, whereas development is here. And when you talk about things like conflict-sensitive development, what you're trying to do is securitize the development conversation. You're trying to divert money away from development into peace. And I think this is a deeply misleading framing of the conversation. And I think, what we need to do is start being much more explicit about the fact that when we do talk about conflict, in many cases you're talking about failures in development, and you're talking about failures of human rights. That in order to address that, you need more and better development and more and better human rights. that you don't need to just spend a lot more money on peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is perhaps one of the best prevention tools we have at the UN, but it's very much the sharp end of a broad set of tools. And that upstream prevention really means investing in those drivers of peace that you've identified. And in many cases, the tools that we have to do that are through our development programming. I think we have a lot of evidence now. Where do you invest? Where are the areas that yield the most impact in terms of building peace? And we have from the 2011 World Development Report, Security, Justice, Jobs. We have the Global Peace Index, and we have the SDGs. And we have the idea that the investments that yield peace as an outcome are very much baked into the SDGs, not just Goal 16 on peaceful, just and inclusive societies, but on gender equality, on inequalities, on environmental risks, etc. I think in many ways we have the tools. It's somewhat of a question of kind of framing, and some of the framing is how we think together about these issues. How we think in terms of risk, and when we talk about risk, a risk to peace isn't just an armed group taking out weapons somewhere in a part of your country. Or a risk to peace also comes when you have a population that doesn't get an education, or you have children leaving schools because their parents can't afford their fees. That you have people graduating from schools and there are no jobs available. That you have pockets of your country where rights are abused, or populations or groups that don't have the same opportunities as others, and that that risks, some of these political immediate risks, the ways that kind of conflict can happen very quickly, can come from many different sources. They can come from violence, but they can come through economic shock, they can come through environmental shocks, and that we need to recognize that countries face a variety of risks across the spectrum of security, economic, rights, environmental, that they have a variety of capacities to manage these risks on their own, and that's something we don't talk about enough. We talk about what the UN is doing, how the UN programs, but we don't talk enough about how countries themselves are addressing these risks. And that we as a UN system have a variety of tools to help kind of supplement or support those national capacities. I think if we start having that conversation in a way that is meant to just have a platform where we share thinking about this, where we ask the questions and share an understanding of what a particular country faces, it lends itself more to these types of solution-based discussions on how we then program. Where are the biggest risks, where are the biggest gaps in national capacities to manage those, and where can we as a UN offer the best value. I don't think we're quite there yet in seeing it this way. I think we're still very invested in our silos, and I think we don't yet talk about this in a more holistic way. I also think as the UN system, we're quite bad about talking about medium and longer term risks. So if we look at kind of global trends and global drivers and what risks are, we tend not to discuss those in UN chambers, or when we do, they've been long-term for so long that we finally have to do something about them. And so I think that's where, hopefully through a partnership with the World Bank, we start to have a much broader understanding of longer-term economic trends. And then I think time to get much more creative about the way we look at these problems. I'll say, one thing in terms of how we come together and ask these questions. One area that I think is one part of the UN system that I think is starting to show the potential of this creative work, and this will come as no surprise to anyone who knows me, is the peace building vision and the peace building architecture. I think was developed as a way to bridge this gap between the silos and integrate the way the UN approaches countries that face the risk of collapse or relapse into conflict. And it's now starting to function as the type of platform it was meant to be. And so we're having a more joined-up conversation about the transition in Liberia, for example. But we're still mostly focused on the types of kind of post-conflict countries that Robert was talking about. I think what we need to do is start using the platforms we have, including the PDC, as a place to really showcase national experiences and national experiences of working with the UN. There was we were just talking about the fact that the UN universities just put out a study on the role of resident coordinators in preventing conflict. I look very much forward to reading it. I think there were a number of countries on there that I don't think about as conflict prevention. You know, I think about those of us who work on conflict. We don't work on the countries that aren't in conflict, and so we don't think very much about what the risks of conflict in those broader basket of countries might be. One last note on kind of where I see the real challenges. I think, you know, we have this good moment in a lot of ways, and then we have the rest of the world and trends in the rest of the world. And what I see, we really see is this kind of resurgence in kind of sovereignty, the assertion of sovereignty, in the sense that, you know, you are not going to come to my country and tell me how to strengthen my governance institutions, or talk to me about access to justice to disadvantaged groups. That you're here to deliver a package, and you're here to deliver the SDGs. And there's certain, you know, in setting national implementation plans, countries do have a certain amount of discretion in what they choose to focus on. And I think, you know, as development practitioners, as the UN system, it's very easy for us to fall back into kind of having the conversation at a technocratic level. That we have a technical conversation and we talk about technocratic tools and we don't engage with these broader political dynamics. I think it's the risk we face every day in this work. I think there are things that make it harder for us to do that. But I don't see how we really deliver on the ambition of this agenda and the ambition of the SDGs if we aren't able to have political conversations about, you know, about decisions, about access to wealth and power in countries, and about, you know, the rights of citizens in those countries. And so, I guess my final and closing plea is that we actually continue to have those uncomfortable conversations and keep them at the forefront of what we do when we talk about this, because ultimately, you know, sustaining peace is long-term, it's incremental. It's only, you know, peace is only built by the citizens and communities within a country, and the relationship between a country and its government. It's not built by the UN. And so we cannot, you know, we can't look away from those conversations, and we can't fail in our duty as the international community to really hold those norms and hold the line on some of those norms and ensure that we continue to have those hard conversations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. You really remind us that it's very difficult to understand what works to build peace if we are analyzing and studying conflict situations, and we really need to unpack what resiliencies are working in countries and how we as the international community can support that. So to shift our discussion a bit and look at the notion of the international community, I turn to you, Susanna, who is sort of our outsider voice today. And given your work on prevention and in-country application, how does the international community understand prevention efforts? And what do we know about best practices in prevention efforts?
So I'm not going to be able to answer that question, but I'm going to give some hints. So thank you all for being here. I don't think that when you walked into this room, few of you were saying, hey, you know, peace is a bad thing, prevention is a bad thing. Like, in many ways, we're convinced, right? That we want countries to be in states of peace, that prevention is the best type of action. The puzzling thing and the frustrating thing is that it still doesn't happen, it still doesn't seem to work. And so for me, this is where the work is needed. The Global Peace Index is extremely important in actually establishing some relationships and providing clear, visible evidence of the relationship between politics, institutions, economics, cooperation, and conflict. The difficult thing is that even at this level, we've just seen a kind of cross-national study. Conflict, cooperation, violence, peace, they coexist, they co-evolve at the subnational level. right? These are complex environments, even those that have not yet broken out into violent conflict. And the UN, NGOs, bilateral donors, multinational corporations, any actor who is actually trying to prevent conflict works with that nuance, works with that messiness. And this is part of what makes it so difficult. So we all agree that peace and prevention are good things, right? But they're not so easy to achieve. Because peace is about who has power and whose voice can be heard and who gets to participate in the cooperative agreements within a country that determine who gets what, when, where, and how. In the liberal democratic or the liberal peace framework that's being put forth here and that is adopted in many circles, peace is about inclusion and about adaptation. Conflict and violence is about exclusion. The important thing that Robert also said is that peace is about maintaining inclusion. This is an active process. This is not something that is done once and for all. This is about establishing institutions that can take in new voices, incorporate new opinions, take in new individuals, give new agency to actors in this complex world where the borders are increasingly fluid. Conflict prevention has similar characteristics. Conflict prevention is not about just doing what you've done. Conflict prevention is about challenging the status quo. That's really difficult. If you look at it from that perspective, you understand why it's so hard. It requires acting before there is an actual necessity to act. Before things have gotten so bad that politicians can't ignore it anymore, that you can't justify action. In a world where everybody is overwhelmed by information, by demands on their time, this requires prioritizing something which may not seem to be a priority. It also requires acting in a highly politically engaged role, meaning it is precisely not technocratic. So it's not just about delegating prevention to the lowest bureaucrat on the totem pole. It's about engaging key decision makers in using their political capital and their political will to actually challenge the status quo and to act preventively. Any institution, the UN, a bilateral donor, an NGO, has limited political capacity to actually spread around. So this means that you can't act preventively everywhere, right? Unless you become a kind of completely flat organization where everybody has political authority. The challenge that I see also in this preventive agenda, and I've been in this now for 25 years, I worked on this in the 1990s as a research associate for the Center for Preventive Action of the Council on Foreign Relations when a lot of these issues were coming up. And we're hearing the same things, right? And so my question is, what's new? And what are you people in the room going to do to actually innovate and to try to create some new action and some new energy in this space that everyone up here has identified? So first, we know that you have to anticipate. You need early warnings, you need to know what's going on. The challenge is, and I think this speaks to one of the real challenges, is that the triggers we will never know. Triggers are triggers. We can have a list of potential triggers for the escalation of violence, but you're never going to know which trigger is going to hit, when and where, no matter how sophisticated your model is. So you're going to have to be on your guard, prepared, and ready to act. What are the institutional implications of that? Mobilize, that we need political will to take action, both to address proximate and structural causes of violence. Mobilizing political will is extremely difficult, and as I said, any institution can only have a limited amount of political priorities because the top level leaders have limited time. So what does that political will look like? And if we focus on mobilizing political will as the end goal, you may not get there. So how can you decentralize authority within your organization so many different actors can operate politically and maybe get some support for it? Act. So we know that we need to act to stop actors and institutions from escalating violence. And we know this action involves changing the status quo. The kind of standard tools are preventive diplomacy and political capacity, mediation, military solutions such as peace operations or other military actions, economic solutions such as sanctions or incentives, using trade or aid or other incentives. But these are all notoriously difficult to actually mobilize. These all have enormous barriers to mobilize preventively. So let me just take the case of development. Development cooperation operates on the basis of agreements with the host government. Institutions engaged in development cooperation get their permission to reside in that country from the host government. They are incentivized to spend money in line with their priorities. If the host government agrees with and supports those priorities, they can do it. If the host government does not agree with and support those priorities, it's very difficult for them to do it. And they don't have much leverage. And this is the paradox, right, of a state-based international system that aims to empower people. That is what we're living with them. And you're not going to do away with these challenges. So the question becomes, how do you actually address them? The other challenge in relation to this is that we know in the kind of preventive discourse that the earlier you are in the escalation toward violence, the easier it is to prevent. But the earlier you are in the escalation toward violence, the more difficult it is to actually mobilize prevention. The later you are in the escalation toward violence, the easier it is, the more difficult it is to prevent. The later you are in the escalation toward violence, the easier it is to mobilize. This is not a problem that is easy to solve. This is not about the UN or member states just doing things in a status quo way. Everything that's been put up today is very much in line with the UN's priorities, is in line with the SDGs. But enacting it, enabling it, and actually seeing it through in these institutions requires some courageous individuals. Credible prevention is about making what we call a kind of credible commitment. It has to be well targeted to the subnational sources of violence, and the commitment has to be credible. What this means is that if you say, I'm going to take away my aid if you do this, you actually have to take away your aid if you do it, right? And often in the case of countries where preventive actions are trying to be, where we're trying to implement preventive actions, these are the cases where countries have the least investment in making their commitments credible. So in many ways, this prevention agenda is not supposed to work because, sorry, I'm the one on the panel who can say that, right? It's not supposed to work because the international system is not necessarily set up to work, and yet sometimes it does. And that's what's important to focus on, and that's what we need to understand better. As Robert said, we have a lot of knowledge about what works in the aftermath of conflict. We have scant knowledge about what works in prevention. We need to understand this better. We need to see that it's not easy, and we need to see that it actually takes investment of people throughout the system using their own political will, using their own advocacy to make preventive action work. So I'll leave it there.